Gee, look, it's wonderful to be here at the College of Agriculture, class of 1955, and its new incarnation with Bob in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, with Bob here in the year 2013. And with deep appreciation and deep respect, all of us, Lester, commend you, and you are someone to emulate for your sustained contributions to two things. I may have to have the handheld if it can't be then. Let me take that, Bob. No, it is. It's not working properly. So, for his sustained contributions to simultaneously improving the human condition and protecting the ecosystems of the world in a complementary way. Very difficult. So, Lester, I'd like to begin, and I thought that the book is just terrific. I mean, it is just, and I'm so glad you agreed to write it and took time from your other. He writes every day, he says in the book, and that's such a discipline that's such a discipline to write every day, all day, every day of the week. To do that on a sustained basis over the course of a career is something, again, to emulate. But the title, Breaking New Ground, I thought really captures what you have done. And the words in it, breaking, as in having to break some eggs to make an omelet, and you've done that in your career. New in terms of the systemic way that you approach things. Before there was collaboration and interdisciplinary research. And the word ground, obviously referring to the intellectual ground, but also back to your agrarian roots. You want to comment to get us going on the title? I mean, it's just perfect.
The attractive thing about the title to me is that it's a double entendre. Because that's what farmers do, they break new ground. But in this case, I was trying to break new ground in sort of looking back at the period that I've lived in, which happens to be now a near 80-year span of extraordinary change in the world. I was born in 1934. And if you were to somehow have an indicator and can chart change, if you could graph it from, say, the year 1 until 1934, it would have been fairly gradual. But then, as we headed for the 40s, suddenly things took off, and they've been going. The rate of change has been extraordinarily rapid since then. And so it has been an interesting time. There are not many of us in the room who can remember the Great Depression and what life was like in this country then, and probably not too many people in the room who can remember World War II. And that was another extraordinary event in historical terms. It is one that changed so much in the world, and it was a very costly lesson, but one that I think we've learned something from, and it's sort of reassuring to know we've not had a major war now for a long time, and that I think is progress.
Bob mentioned you began as sort of the son of a farmer in South Jersey, and those roots there is growing the Rutgers tomato then, right? Sort of gave you a set of values that have been guiding principles for you for your whole career. Could you speak to those values as you learned as a farmer and a young man?
Well, first of all, growing up on a farm is really an education in itself. We forget how much you learn in that process. And then in my case, with my younger brother, we started our own tomato growing operation. 1951, we had bought an old case tractor. Some farmer had traded in for a new tractor for a couple $100. Got it running and rented a couple fields, planted tomatoes, and we were in the tomato business. The first year it was 7 acres. We made enough to then make a down payment on a new tractor that fall. And so I was in my freshman year here then, so I suggested to my brother that he should buy the tractor at age 14. And so he went to the farm equipment dealer, and the dealer probably said, you know, and how can we help you? And he said, well, I want to buy a tractor. And it took a while for them to realize that he was serious. He wanted to buy a new tractor. And so we did. We got a Ford, 2-plow Ford that was new, and that became the basis. And then we had a couple of other tractors later. But that was sort of the beginning of the of our tomato growing effort. And we learned a lot. I mean, you learn a lot about agriculture, of course, but also management and recruiting help, particularly at picking time, managing people in the operation. And those were all skills that acquired early in life have been extraordinarily helpful to me since, whether heading a government agency with operations in 40-some countries around the world, or launching 2 research institutes working on global environmental issues. So those early years for me set the stage, and they were challenging at the time, obviously, because we were farming and going to school at the same time. I also did sports, football and wrestling, cross-country, track. Wrestling was the first sport that I lettered in. So another thing I learned in that situation, the combination of school and farming and sports, was time management. You have to learn how to use time efficiently, and I think both my brother and I benefited from that early farming experience while we were in school.
You came to Rutgers, and you discovered you were on scholarship, which was a great relief, as could be expected in those humble conditions. But I was just thrilled to hear you describe coming to Rutgers, and your excitement of coming to Rutgers still leaps across the pages and the decades in your book. And that's just a wonderful, wonderful thing to see. And you described yourself intellectually as being a kid in a candy store. To our students here, what was the candy store and how did the kid take advantage?
Well, from the beginning I had an interest in the sciences, and I also resisted the idea of becoming a specialist. I wanted to deal with the big picture. And here at Rutgers at the College of Agriculture, I took 24 science courses in 19 fields. If you can imagine being spread so thinly, but in each of those courses, I learned the basic principles, the vocabulary, and so forth, so that later, when I was working on larger issues and writing about global issues, I could draw on that sort of basic understanding. So those courses in 19 fields really set the stage for many of the things I was able to do later.
You made particular mention of a public speaking and a communications course that you took, and then later in your memoir, you describe the importance of dissemination of ideas and your focus on making that research, impeccably as it is done, accessible and communicating it on a global scale. You make that connection from that course to that drive that you've always had through your 2 institutes to accessible worldwide research?
To graduate from the College of Agriculture at the time I was here, you had to have a full year of public speaking. And it was taught by Richard Rieger, R-E-A-G-E-R, who was the author of the textbook, You Can Talk Well. And it wasn't that taking the course would make you a great speaker, but at least you would learn the basic principles and the techniques of engaging an audience. And so if you want to communicate, you have to be able to, it helps if you can both speak and write. You have to write, incidentally, because, and not only, if you're trying to reach a global constituency, you not only have to write, but you have to write books, because that's the only segment of the information sector where there are extensive translation possibilities. Bob mentioned the 648 or whatever total editions of books, but that's because the books are widely translated. And you have to be able to do that if you're trying to reach a global constituency. If you want to change the world, you have to reach the world. And books are the best way of doing that. It's not just the books themselves. So books generate reviews. Excerpts are published in many different languages. So it becomes an important part of disseminating the results of research at the global level. I think I wandered on that answer. Did I get most of it?
Yes. Well, we think, yeah, that was good. Very good. Sure. A little bit off. Take that. After college, you had the opportunity through 4-H and USDA as a young farmer to go to India as a very young man. And you described that as a transformative experience. And it looks to me it was based. What did you see and how did that impact you for your career?
Well, as a youngster, I had read books about international travel, Richard Halliburton's books, The Book of Marvels and others, and a book by, I can't quite remember her name now, about Africa. And these books spawned an interest in the world outside the world that I knew. So I ended up, now I've gotten lost myself. What was the question again?
It was about the way your experience of living in an Indian village you call it transformative, right, in your book, and it seems to me that's a good description of its impact on you.
Right. At the time, I spent the half year living in villages in India. There were not very many Americans in India then. This was 1956. International air travel had begun. Aircraft were starting to fly, but there's still a lot of transatlantic travel by boat. And the group of us, the 10 young farmers that were sent to India to live in villages, we went together, but once we got there, we scattered. And it was so interesting because if you're to pick two major countries in the world, one that was the most advanced agriculturally and economically, and one that was the least advanced, the U.S. and India would probably be would represent those very well, and so it was living with Indian families, getting to know them, and working with them in the fields, and literally living in families and being part of the family that give you a feel for, in my case, for another culture, a very different culture, religiously different, culturally different, technologically far apart, and it was a broadening experience. And in looking back, I think it did help me to understand agriculture in developing countries, for example. But in looking back, it was part of a broadening experience that enabled me to look at the world differently than I would have if I had only if I had stayed in New Jersey on the farm there.
Did that impact your assessment as a young analyst later with the secretary and the Indian famine and Indian need for reforming agriculture? Was there a connection there?
Well, there was. The secretary had a request from the U.S. aid mission in India to send someone to India to help the aid mission analyze the proposed new 5-year plan for India. And so they wanted someone to look at the agricultural part of that, so I ended up going to do that. The interesting thing was that when I arrived in New Delhi and was beginning to focus on this, I noticed some things that led me to be concerned about the food situation in India. I mean, just to cite a couple examples, there was a guy working in the embassy in New Delhi that I wanted to see when I got there, but he had said he was going to be, it was October and he always went duck hunting up north, so he wouldn't be in the office in New Delhi. But when I got there, he was in New Delhi, and I said, how come you're in New Delhi? He said, well, the lake where I usually go duck hunting doesn't have any water in it. I thought, wow. And then I was talking to a guy at a reception, the head of Exxon in India. Now it's what? It was Esso then, it's now Exxon Mobil. And I said, you know, something like, how's business? Oh, he said, we're really doing very well right now. He said, we're selling diesel fuel for irrigation, you know, on a scale we've never seen before. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, farmers are pumping day and night trying to save their crops because the monsoon really had failed. But at that time, the government of India was still projecting a bumper crop. They hadn't sort of realized what was happening, and so I began to think about this. And also, then as now, I read 3 or 4 newspapers each day: the Indian Express, the Hindustan Times, the Times, and I noticed reports coming in from various states describing the harvest or the shortfalls in the harvest, and I began to sense that there was a real problem on the horizon here, and we needed to do something about it. So I translated these bits and pieces of information into an estimate of the crop for that year, and I sent a cable to Secretary Freeman saying that you know, the Indian government is expecting or claiming they're going to harvest 95 million tons of grain, and I said, I don't think they're going to harvest 85 million tons, and it could be substantially less than that, which means there's going to be a huge gap here. And I remember when I had written the cable that I was going to send Secretary Freeman, because if they were going to have a huge shortfall, we needed to get going to get grain moving, because you don't get wheat from Kansas to villages in India easily. There was a lot to do. So we began looking seriously at this and ended up shipping a fifth of the U.S. wheat crop to India that year to avoid famine.
That's an extremely impressive accomplishment, as Bob alluded to. At age 31, this occurred, really avoiding massive loss of life in India as the result of some significant research. And again, the power of research to translate out to improve the human condition, and also then led to some significant investment in agricultural reform in India.
Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, was president at the time, and Freeman had sent him a copy of the cable that I had sent to Washington, and President Johnson said, you know, we should get them to undertake agricultural reform in exchange for this massive amount of food aid they were going to need. And so I was then asked to come up with a new agricultural plan for India. Remember, originally I was asked to review the agricultural plan for India. Now I was actually writing one, and we introduced some basic policy changes. For example, up until then, the food price policy, the grain price policy in India was a ceiling price, trying to keep prices down. So the political leaders were catering to the urban interests. They wanted to keep prices down. And I pointed out that this was not the way, the direction they should be moving in. Instead of a ceiling price for consumers, they should have a support price for farmers to get them to invest in production and to be assured of a price at harvest time that would justify investing in agriculture to get things moving. So LBJ saw very clearly the need for reform in India and the opportunity for the U.S. to use its food aid. I call it food aid, but it was a fifth of the U.S. wheat crop. It was a very substantial thing to reform Indian agriculture. So I happened to be in the right place at the right time to sort of translate LBJ's interests into actual policies, agricultural policies in India.
Modestly said, I mean, very, very much of a pivotal moment. And again, then replicated, as we'll see in a minute, in China. There's a wonderful image, I thought, in your book that you refer to several times as intersections with history. I have this vision of your career, rich and full, going around the world, and you are intersecting, and just by chance and then by not chance events, intersecting with historical figures on this trajectory of your life and your career. Could you describe a few of those intersections that are most memorable to you?
Yeah, I came up with this term, excuse me, intersections with history, because of intersecting with people. I mean, one example was one of the scientists that I greatly admired was Marie Curie, and she had single-handedly advanced science in a way that few scientists do. I mean, she won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one in physics, and she was a woman. You know, when there weren't any women scientists around. It was just an extraordinary story. So in 1974, this was the period, the 72-74 period after the Russian wheat harvest had failed, when grain prices jumped in the world market. So I was invited to give a talk in New York City to the Cosmopolitan Club, which is sort of a blue-stocking women's club in New York. And what I wanted to do, the woman who called me was named Eve Labouisse. She had married Henry Labouisse, who had been mayor of New Orleans and later the first head of UNICEF and so forth. And her name was actually Eve Curie Labouisse. She was the daughter of Marie Curie. And so meeting her, and she actually introduced me at the talk and said she had read some of my books, and I had to tell her that I had read her book about her mother, because she wrote a biography about her mother shortly after her mother's death.
Well, I think it's a lovely metaphor, that intersections with history, and you've been, and there's repeated themes of that through the book, and it's a pleasure to read of all the major historical figures that Lester has interacted with, some by chance and others seeking him out, and it's well described.
Let me mention,
Please.
one or two other sort of humorous ones. I was on a book tour for State of the World. Each year I'd go to Europe and other places in the world to promote the latest annual edition of State of the World. And one day in Paris, I was briefing Mitterrand, Francois Mitterrand, who was president at the time, on the state of the world. And we were sitting in his office in a corner. I was on one side, he on the other, and the woman who was interpreting in between. And we were talking, and he had a bank of phones on his desk, and one of them started ringing, and he said, excuse me, but I think I better take that. So he went over and spoke 20 or 30 seconds in French, put it down, came back, and he said, that was Bush. I told him to call back in 15 minutes.
He probably had more value from those 13 minutes with you. Terrific.
Here's another one. My office is in Washington, D.C., in a building just off DuPont Circle. And one night, I was working a bit in the evening, and it was, I don't know, 6 or 7 o'clock, and I'd gone down the hall of the men's room, and there met a young man, African-American, and we were just talking. He said, well, what's your name? What do you do? He was new in the building, and I told him. And then as we were going out and we're in front of the elevators, he said, he hadn't given me his name. He said, oh, by the way, he said, my name is Cord Jefferson. And I said, I thought to myself, there's something different about that name for an African-American. Cord. Cord is a name that upper middle class families would give to their sons who go to pricey prep schools, And so I said, are you one of the Jeffersons? He said, yes, the Sally Hemings line. I said, let me shake your hand again. Anyhow, there are these little things that happen that are interesting. I may think of some more of them, but go ahead with the next question.
Sure. You wrote a very provocative book that received an enormous amount of attention, Who Will Feed China? And you associated sort of the increase in demand for food supplies and then the supply lagging that increase as industrialization occurs. And it provoked a very, as you might expect, a reaction from the Chinese government that said basically, we will feed China ourselves. And eventually you were shown to be correct, and ultimately China made significant investments in agriculture as a result of the rather extensive and heated debate that book brought about. But at the end of your discussion of that, you said it remains an issue today. Can you describe that view of China today? And you use the phrase there, China gets richer and sicker. And I just found that very encapsulating of the issues facing a developing nation with 2 billion people.
In 1994, I wrote an article for World Watch magazine which I headed at the time, and it was entitled, Who Will Feed China? And I thought it was a question that needed to be raised because in China we have 1.3 billion people, 1.2 billion then, 1.3 billion now, with rapidly rising incomes moving up the food chain. And when you get that many people moving up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products, you really can put a lot of pressure on world resources. And so I wrote the article, Who Will Feed China? And that Sunday, it was reprinted in the front of the Washington Post Outlook section, but the editors changed the title from Who Will Feed China to How China Will Starve the World. On Monday morning, the Minister of Agriculture in Beijing held a press conference responding to my article. And the bottom line was, he said that I was apparently well-intentioned, but that I didn't understand Chinese agriculture. China has always fed itself, and it always would. And what I didn't what I knew intellectually but was not so sensitive to psychologically was that all the leaders in Beijing in 1994 were survivors of the Great Famine of 1959-61, when 36 million people starved to death. Those are the official numbers, 36 million people. And so there was this great sensitivity to the idea that, political sensitivity, the idea that China might have to turn to the outside world for a growing share of its food supply. So this created quite a stir, and then it sort of died down. And then I was in Japan and was being interviewed by a writer for a reporter who was working for Reuters. So he was asking questions and sort of opening this issue up again. And then, because Reuters is a worldwide wire service, the story went around the world, was reprinted, went into China. And it really began to get the attention of the Chinese again. So I became sort of, for a while, persona non grata in China. And the things that spun off from that were just fascinating. If I gave a public lecture almost anywhere in the world on the food situation, including what was happening in China and my interpretation and analysis of that, there would be someone in the audience who at the end of the talk would jump up and challenge what I had to say. It could be in Oslo, in Zurich, in Tokyo, you name it. It was an interesting situation. And then I was invited to a meeting of the Interaction Council, which is an international group of former heads of state. And they were formed to work on issues that they didn't get to take care of when they were in office for political reasons or whatever, poverty, environment, and food, and so forth. And so they asked me to speak at their meeting. And they also invited, as a discussant of my presentation, a former vice premier of China who had been in office for many years. And he'd actually started with Mao in the hills way back. So he had a long history of leadership within the Communist Party. And so he was the discussant of my paper. The interesting thing was, he brought his discussion of my paper and had it printed, brought it with him before he even knew what I was going to say. So that was kind of interesting. And then at about that time, I was at a reception in Tokyo, and I knew that Huang Hua had two sons, both educated in this country, one at Harvard, the other at the University of Missouri. And it turned out that the one from the University of Missouri was at this reception. And so I met him and we exchanged business cards, and he was working for Smith Barney, the US investment firm in Hong Kong. And I thought to myself, in one generation from the Great March to Smith Barney, then there was another incident at about the same time when Huang Hua's wife, who was a demographer by training, asked when we were going to be going on a dinner cruise in Tokyo Bay, one of these deals where you go for a cruise and have dinner and so forth. And she asked if she could sit next to me. And I said, sure, that would be great. So you have to imagine we're in deck chairs sitting on the boat, and she's wearing the Chinese dress with the slit skirt and so forth. And so we sit down, and she opens her purse, and she takes out a piece of paper that had been folded over and over again. It was a Xerox of the original article that had appeared in World Watch magazine, Who Will Feed China? And she went through paragraph by paragraph and explained my errors for nearly an hour. I mean,
you're a marked person.
And let's see, there are probably some other.
Well, let's move on.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move on, all right?
That was fun, though.
That was fun, okay. You have a new book, Plan B as opposed to Plan A, which is business as usual. And your work spans everything. You were talked about globalization before the word came into being, and you talk with worlds without borders, and you talk about forests and deforestation and soils and water and desertification. But Plan B is this vision of a world where you lay out what's wrong, what to do, how to do it, and what's it going to cost. So my ears pricked up on this latter part, being an economist. And you have a very ambitious goal there, or 80% reduction in carbon emissions by the year 2020. And I wanted to remind us collectively, the faculty here, that in front of us today are members of the class of 2017. So it's not that far away. But you argue in there, or you state, that tax restructuring is fundamental. And with that, I interpret that as the pricing of carbon. France does it, Norway does it, British Columbia does it, the sovereign state of California is trying to do it, Australia, the EU with cap and trade. What is your assessment of the need to, I want you to explain that tax restructuring that you have in mind, right, so that we can get a sense of the incentives and the disincentives.
One of the problems associated with burning fossil fuels is that we pay the cost of pumping the oil, for example, getting it to a refinery and then getting the gasoline to the local service station. But we do not pay the indirect costs, such as climate change or air pollution or what have you. And in some cases, the indirect costs could actually exceed the direct costs. And so this is one of the basic weaknesses in economics. The market is a weakness in the market. The market is very good at incorporating direct costs, but not at incorporating indirect costs. So the way we could do that is simply to introduce a tax that would represent the indirect costs. Then we would have a much more honest economy in terms of being based on real costs and complete costs. And it's interesting because it doesn't change the amount of taxes we pay, but instead of taxing labor, we would tax carbon emissions. And that would have a very positive employment effect as well. So that's what the tax restructuring is all about. It's not to change how much tax we pay. It's just that we would reduce income taxes and offset that with a carbon tax, and in the process accelerate the shift from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy.
And be revenue neutral, as you note, yes. Well, the easy questions are over now. And Bob said that it was going to be, he was going to toss softballs, but maybe this is not a fastball, but it might be a little bit of a slider or curve, okay?
It sounds interesting already.
Yeah, you're ready? All right, okay. You mention in your book that you've had critics, and you speak of a couple of them, and I want to pick up the name Julian Simon and the famous issue of The Bet with your good colleague Paul Ehrlich. And this, for the audience, was a bet between an economist, a pretty sort of hard calculating person. You know the difference between an economist and an accountant? An economist is good with statistical reasoning and deductive logic, but never had the personality to be an accountant. So this...
You said that, I did.
Yes, that's fair enough. This is a very famous bet that occurred between what Julian described as the doomsdayers, Lester and his colleagues, were going to run out of fill in the blank, coal, wood, oil, etc., and an economist which says the price signals, and what Lester was just talking about is to get the price signals right where the market fails to incorporate these external and indirect costs of activities. But they bet that, and Julian said, I will bet you that in a decade, whatever commodity you want to measure will have gone down in price, as opposed to we are running out of, and you would think the markets then would be, things would become scarce. And in that decade, Paul Ehrlich lost. Everything came down in price. And the reason was sort of the things that Lester was talking about, the incentives created by markets to rearrange resources, technological progress, and so forth. Could you update us on your thinking about that bet in a climate change scenario?
Well, the interesting thing about the bet to me was the time span. Within a decade, the decade they were betting on, Julian Simon won that. There was no question. But if it had been extended to 2 decades or more, then the outcome could have been very different. And what we see today is that the costs of, well, the world price of grain has doubled over the last 7 years, for example. And we see the cost of many raw materials, many minerals going up. I mean, copper being one of the more dramatic among these. So I think Paul Ehrlich was right, but he didn't have the right time span. I think that was, as I see it, the key. Now, I was in Paris some time back reading a newspaper, and a guy had pointed out that with current copper prices, forgotten what the company is called, sort of what would have been the AT&T of the UK, the one that controlled all the communications lines and so forth. He pointed out that that company whose stock was worth about $1 billion, you could buy it for $1 billion, but it owned $10 billion worth of copper. They were in the wires, connecting, in the old-fashioned grid.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to make, get a really good return on an investment,
And dismantle it. Right.
just start pulling those wires.
Well, that actually happens in homes in neighborhoods that are hit by disasters.
It happened in Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., and these guys had their things out. They roll up the cable, and they were taking it down. And the police came along and asked them what they're doing. They said they were doing a replacement of an old cable with a new one. So the police wandered away, and by the time they did, they had I don't know how many tons of copper wire loaded up and ready to sell.
Prices affect behavior, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We want to leave some time for some questions from the audience, and they've been very attentive. And so let me conclude, Lester, with something maybe for our students. You have, you started sort of 3-4 careers over again each time, but you're responsible for the development of 2 extraordinarily successful research institutes, World Watch and Earth Policy. And you've hired many, many young people. You make a point in your book that you often hire people right out of school, right out of college. What do you look for in hiring a new graduate, speaking to our students?
Mm-hmm. One of the things you look for, obviously, is intelligence. But there are quite a few intelligent people in the world. What you also look for is imagination. Good researchers are imaginative. And that is a much more scarce resource. And you have to look for commitment to the issues. So people are willing to work hard, because it does take a lot of work to change things sometimes. This is not a 40-hour-a-week proposition doing what we do. And we also look for people who have a fairly broad base. And there have been times when we have hired people that you would never think of as researchers, like an Oberlin music major, for example, one of the best researchers we ever had. But he did not. I mean, he was a graduate of Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, so he had good science foundation. But He was a very good researcher and analyst, and so I look at personalities, and it is much easier, particularly when you're doing something like a State of the World report where it takes a team effort. If you hired a team of PhDs and tried to do that, good luck. You know, it wouldn't happen. But if you have a bunch of kids fresh out of school, you know, they'll do it.
Okay, yeah.
They'll do it and enjoy it in the process. I've always been biased toward hiring young people. I think over the last 50 years I've hired maybe 2 PhDs, and neither one worked out.
Hear that, faculty, right, or colleagues, right? How many PhDs does it take to fill in the blank?